we'll make a start. I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar Building Soil Carbon Through Land Management Strategies in the Riverine Plains by Dr. Abe Gibson and Dr. Karl Andersson, and brought to you by the Soil CRC. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we are coming from today, the Yorta country and Bangaran Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Zaira Zamudio from Riverine Plains. I'm joined today by my colleague Jane McKay. And just letting you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to the registered attendees and put on Riverine Plains and Soil CRC websites. So if you have any issues with this, please let me know. And some instructions. At the top of your screen, you'll find the Q&A icon in the toolbox. Feel free to put questions in there during the presentation so we don't interrupt the speakers. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be having a discussion time, and I will read those questions for Karl and Abe to answer. Tonight's webinar is the fifth of 7 webinars presented by the Soil CRC, supported by the New South Wales government as part of the Primary Industry Productivity and Abatement Program. This program is providing information to land managers about carbon farming to help them make evidence-based decisions. At the first webinar, we had the Visualizing Australasian Soils and the New South Wales eSPADE provide spatial soil and land characteristics to assist with soil carbon planning. At the second webinar, learn about interpretation of soil data and land capability for considering a soil carbon project, including the factors above and below the ground impacting soil carbon, interpreting soil data to assess land suitability for increasing soil carbon, and identifying opportunities for additional land management practices to optimize soil carbon. The third and fourth were similar to this one that we will be running tonight, addressing opportunities and practices for soil carbon management in different regions. Recordings of this webinar can be found at the New South Wales DPIRD website and Soil Network of Knowledge website. Tonight, our presenters will focus on our region, including soil carbon levels, what we can expect for our region, the factors that influence the carbon levels, and the management practice that can increase or maintain soil carbon levels. The next 2 webinars will be hosted by other grower groups in New South Wales and will be covering specific land management activities suited to their local environment. Tonight, I'd like to introduce first to Dr. Abe Gibson. Abe is a researcher at the Southern Cross University with extensive expertise in soil sciences, particularly focusing on soil chemistry, soil carbon sequestration, and climate change processes. His work emphasized improving soil health and productivity while exploring sustainable strategies to enhance carbon sequestration in agricultural systems. Abe's research aims to integrate these findings into practical management strategies for farmers, making a measurable impact on both environmental sustainability and agricultural productivity. We also have Dr. Karl Andersson, research officer, and he's a soil scientist with 25 years of experience throughout the New South Wales. Karl has worked in regions from the high rainfall to semi-arid zones in fields including soil mapping, agronomy, soil carbon, nutrient cycling, irrigation, and dry land and urban development. Karl is based at Tamworth Agricultural Institute and works to enhance soil management practices within the New South Wales agriculture sector and is experienced researcher and communicator of soil carbon information. I would like to welcome you both and thank you for joining us tonight.
All right, thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Excuse me. So as Sarah mentioned, we're talking about soil carbon in the Riverine Plains, and a little bit of a tweak. Rather than focusing on building, I'm sort of going to talk about understanding and managing what we have in terms of soil carbon, and importantly, not just focusing on the carbon part of it, but focusing on the soil part of it. So with that, a quick outline is to look at soil in the landscape and then carbon as part of that, moving through the soil, coming down into the Riverine Plains as a regional setting, and then some considerations if you're looking at projects. So, as Sarah mentioned, this is part of a series of workshops. I will just go across some of the basics quickly, just to sort of help set the scene for the discussion. But do feel free to have a look back at those webinars as well. So what is soil carbon? What are we talking about? The key thing is that it's soil organic matter is the most important part. Carbon is part of organic matter, and organic matter is something we can see. It's this dark material here at the top of the soil. Where there's not much organic matter, iron takes over as the colour, which is what we've got here deeper down. Here it's red and rusty and well drained. And when there's no iron, there's not much else, and it's pale. So we get differences running down the profile. Basically, it turns dirt into soil, and it's a real key component of nutrient cycling and resilience in the soil. And it's what you want. Carbon is that part of it, and you might hear terms like particulate and humus and mineral associated and pyrogenic or charcoal, and they're basically just stages of decomposition of the organic matter. If you're looking to go from these general ideas of carbon in soil and organic matter in soil to counting it, then you need to know bulk density, which tells you how much actual soil there is. So a quick number to easy to remember maybe is a bulk density of 1 gram per cubic centimetre. Means that for every 10 centimetre increment in the soil, there's 1,000 tonnes of soil per hectare. So 1% of that is 10 tonnes of carbon, if that was your numbers. And if you're counting, that's what they want. Now, what do soils look like? Here we've got a couple of different soils in high rainfall area. One's a granite, one's a basalt. The granite with the sandy material on top, you can see the differentiation. Organic matter, as I said, pale. The basalt is a much more uniform, gradational type of soil, and it's an easier type of soil for roots to grow through. Natural changes, differences in parent material. And those changes can happen really quickly, and you'd be familiar with this sort of stuff, but you can see changes in the paddock sometimes. Here we've got a basalt running over the top of a granite. Take that material through different climates, rainfall areas, and you go from east here with high rainfall, moving down into, this is up near Tumbarumba in the highlands. This is the same material down at Wagga, and there's much less of the dark material there and less of the palish underneath, and then go further out towards sort of Mount Hope, pushing into the rangelands, and we don't have that dark material at the top really at all to speak of. Natural changes in your soil. Running down a slope, you have changes as well. Soil depth, colour, basically the sort of bucket size is influenced by the position in your landscape. And that helps us understand how things grow and organic matter moving in and through the soil. We have similar sorts of changes in alluvial areas, which might look flat, but where those old price streams move around, subtle differences in elevation. You can see sandier soils a little bit higher up, moving through your sort of loamy soils, clay soils, into the heavy soils out the back. And you can, again, see those changes moving across the landscape. So just sort of some things to keep in mind when you're talking about carbon as a property of soil. So carbon gets into the soil through photosynthesis. It's basically in these sort of pools, as I mentioned before. Labile means that this stuff is relatively easy to degrade. After it's broken down a bit, it gets associated with clay particles, say, and it gets a bit of protection, physical or chemical protection. That's done by bugs processing the organic matter for their purposes, nutrients and energy. Most of it is respired. There's also increased respiration where soils are disturbed. Product removal is, of course, a source of organic matter moving off the system. And we have this, hopefully not too much erosion, but it does exist. And it's a real part of our systems. Now, coming down into our local area that we're talking about, this is basically the footprint of Riverine Plains. And if we sort of take this on a map, satellite map, it's covering up here from Wagga down through Albury and Benalla and into Victoria down here. This is a handy website up here through Geoscience Australia. It's got lots of different layers on it that can help. You can zoom in and out and can check out your local area. And some of the things in there, it shows the elevation. So we've got quite a range coming from the plains up into the hills here. So quite a range of environments, a range of different parent materials that we just talked about. These pink ones here with the crosses, they're granites. Different mapping system as you cross the border, but basically we've got those granites continuing. We've got older metasedimentary sort of softer materials running through here and some volcanic material. So that's some useful material to zoom in and have a look at where you are, what you're on. Now, coming down into some data to put some numbers around things. This is from a project we worked on a while ago now, nearly 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, where we collected a bunch of soil samples with growers throughout the region here, as you see. We looked at the 0 to 10 centimetres, which is what's displayed here. The red ones are low, and moving up through green into brown and black is high. That's in the 0 to 10 centimetres. We did 10 to 20 as well, and basically the levels are much lower between the two. There's some interesting things where this patch around here was sampled after the Junee fires, and there was lots of loss and erosion, basically. So those numbers are lower. But these sort of start to, when you looked closely, they're matching parent material and matching climate. You can see the effect of rainfall here. As we're moving from low rainfall into higher, we're getting our colours are changing from reds to greens to browns and darker colours through here. So there's natural underlying properties. And with that, across the whole area, we've got these trends in these 50 millimetre rainfall bands where not much was happening until you hit about 500, 550 mils, and there's an increase in general in the carbon levels, and then it sort of plateaued off again once you're up into the higher areas. Similar, but less so in the subsoil, subsurface at least. Not much of a change until about 800, 850 mils there. Where we're operating is in this 400-ish to 700-ish mil range through the Riverine Plains footprint. So that's fine. That's a bit of a background of soil types and levels of carbon in soil. But what people, I guess, are interested is in the dynamics and increasing. First, we could appreciate the losses in carbon. Here's a pattern from Queensland sites where generally the longer that clearing and cultivation went on, the more carbon left the system, and it started to plateau. So it reaches a lower level. What's really concerning with that is the decreasing production as well. Whether that's not just purely due to organic matter or carbon, but it's part of the system. So looking to address that is an important thing. On the flip side, we can look at increases, and here's some data that was modelled over a long period of time with the data points there. So these models were able to relatively well mimic the types of dynamics going on in these systems. Where what they're looking at is the top one there is farmyard manure being applied. When it stopped, it started to drop down again. Reapplied, up again. Here's mineral fertilisers, and this one was unfertilised. So you see these differences start to emerge with land use. Here's an even starker change of manure being applied and then stopped, and it falls back down. So inputs and maintaining inputs is a key part of maintaining carbon levels in your soil. So recovery from lost areas is, of course, really important and of interest. Here's a table from one of John Gray's papers a few years ago where they summarised a bunch of studies from around the world and more locally in New South Wales and southern New South Wales, where these sorts of ranges were observed of 0.2 to 0.5, 1 tonne per hectare. Similar sorts of ranges that you can expect from putting different practices in control, fairly controlled situations. Now, there's recovery and there's keeping it. So, as I said, organic matter, it's throughput, it's dynamic. Bugs are eating it and cycling it, and you need to maintain your inputs. Here's some work from the lower end of our rainfall zones. It's up at Condo, so it's out of our area, but it's in that sort of lower rainfall band of 450 mil. And we've got increases in all of these different practices of continuous cropping, perennial pastures, reduced conservation tillage, increases in carbon levels there over 13 odd years, which is really good to see. Even we're getting a trend was emerging in the subsurface. So this is percent. It's not the carbon stock. It's percent. But what we then saw was, or what they found was that those increases disappeared, and they didn't just disappear. Sometimes they've actually gone below where they were. So the thing to take from this is that there's dynamics, and it's basically a window in which soil operates. And so long as we're not going down, then that's a positive in itself. If we can get this floor moving up, then that's really good, and that's probably what the focus of things is. That's not the only thing. Here's from around Cowra, 630 mil now. This was a project where 9 properties were selected because they had low carbon levels. After the first 5-year measurement, 6 of them had increased, which was really positive, sounded good. But after the subsequent measurement, only 1 of those had kept everything, and 1 dropped back a bit, but the other ones had dropped back to lower, and other ones had not changed or dropped even further. So it's not just a cure-all. It's not just an easy thing to say, I want to do it, it's going to happen. We've got to understand that the dynamic nature of the system. So this is coming out soon, this paper. More sort of maybe anecdotal type of information that was recently put out through MLA on the northern tablelands. So we've got a higher rainfall now, 780 mils. Different climate to Riverine Plains, but just to again show that the types of fluctuations that can happen in a 2-year window, a range of paddocks some going up, some going down, and quite big changes. Yeah, so just appreciating that dynamic nature of the system. More local data for you guys, where carbon had been, soils had been collected over 3, 4, 5 years, I think, and I've just plotted here against pH. Interesting that maybe some of these soils with the higher carbon levels have got the lower pH, and that might indicate a bit of a constraint in the system where bugs aren't being active. However, there was a few paddocks. There's about 100 paddocks where samples were taken more than once, 2, 3, 4 years apart, and in those, sometimes the number was higher, sometimes there was no change, and sometimes they were lower. And basically, there's a fairly normal distribution around 0. So not too much happening in that short term. Going back to that bigger data set that I showed earlier from southern New South Wales, and moving out of a controlled type of trial into how do things work in the, out in the real world, I guess, on farm. When we went back to that data and looked at the general land use, we looked at, to simplify it enough, we could look at areas that had been under pasture or crop for more or less than 5 years. So P2 is pasture for more than 5 years. Crop similarly, crop more than 5 years, and crop less than 5 years. And out of all that area, with all of those soil tests that you saw, there was only this one area here where pastures, more than 5-year-old pasture, had higher carbon levels than the crop. That's in the 0 to 10 centimetres. And those pasture sites actually had higher rainfall than the crop. When we go into the subsurface, the 10 to 20 centimetre layer, this is where I found it interesting to try to understand what was going on. We've got areas where crop is higher than pasture. Up here and through here. or pasture might be higher than crop. Long-term pasture might be higher than long-term crop, but then higher than short-term pasture. So just putting in a practice or hoping that something will happen doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. Again, some more local data. This was from Mick Davey and Terry Cohen as part of the SCARP project. And Mick divided this up into the plains areas to the west, drier, and the slopes in the east. In those two types of areas, he found that the pastures did have higher carbon levels than crop, and they were on the sort of sloping country, especially the 7 to 10% slope. 10% being a 1 metre drop in 10 metres, so moving up into a sloping sort of thing. But out on the plains, in the low rainfall areas, there was sort of too much sort of noise or variability that there wasn't any sort of changes noted out there between the different practices. Looking at a grazing trial that's again just about to be published from Orange, where sort of higher end. Again, it's out of our area, but what we struggle with is having enough temporal data, having long-term data to see what's happening in a spot. So in this one, it went from crop to permanent pasture, and there was a relatively rapid increase in carbon levels, but then it sort of stabilized towards the end of it. Hopefully this project, this trial can keep going. As it went on, there was that difference in the pasture, but there was also rotational practices and different stocking rates, and there was no differences observed in those things. There was more in the rotational, but not in the sort of density of that. So there was a increase in carbon where there was more grass and litter, and less bare ground. And the starting point was also important, where the lower it was, that gave it some room to move. Overall, looking across Australia, Sarah McDonald put a paper out recently reviewing everything that was available in Australia of grazing management, and found that there was no significant impact of that sort of stocking rate or intensity where these things had been measured. There's about 30 papers. Definitely there was differences in biomass and ground cover and those sorts of things, and perenniality and that sort of stuff. And that's really good for productivity, but translating that into soil carbon is another thing that was not actually sort of substantiated. How can we shift it then? There are these dynamics going on. One of the really important things is looking at overall fertility and nutrition. This is work that's been put out relatively recently by Elizabeth Coonan, looking at the gin and dairy work that Richard Simpson and others maintained for over 20 years, where there was high P and low P soils, started off at a low level. The aim was to increase productivity, and they increased it from 9 to 18 DSE, and measuring carbon over that time found an increase through to 60 centimetres, about half a tonne a year. So P is key with sulphur and nitrogen in organic matter. So not just carbon, but the organic matter cycle is really key. So having that, having enough nutrients in there to build and maintain is important. It's not the only thing that's been done. Many other studies have found this sort of similar thing where nutrients are important, going back quite a while. You can get some perverse sort of outcomes as well, where there might be a constraint of low nutrition and bugs aren't active. You provide enough nutrition, and then the bugs kick into gear and can start decomposing organic matter that was there. And that's something that was found in some long-term work in America, I think, by Kahn. Back to cropping again, a global review found that there's very limited scope to get increases, especially sort of once you're at a level in that sort of window where it's operating. Some increases in the surface, but also some lower levels just underneath, but overall not that much to speak of. And that was similar to what was Fiona Robertson and Nash found in Victoria, that there was limited potential for cropping practices to increase carbon levels in Victoria. So there are still really good reasons to try to manage for everything that you would do to try to increase carbon levels is about trying to increase organic matter throughput and productivity, and that's all good stuff. Some of the things you can do is looking at your soil and observing what the constraints may be. Can you lift it off a low level to a higher level? Hard pans are a real constraint that people would be familiar with. That might be a legacy thing from old practices, and the problem of them is that water doesn't get in. It can create really sort of harsh environments and just slow root growth and end up living in a really shallow soil instead of a deeper soil. Acidity, another real problem. Surface acidity is something that people can deal with relatively readily, but subsurface acidity is a creeping and increasing problem. And Jason Condon in particular is looking at this sort of stuff. Jason's in Wagga and looking at finer increments and seeing where the constraints are in the soil. Here we've got a lucerne that was recently established. It had been limed, get it ready because lucerne's not very tolerant, and we can see how tolerant it isn't by these roots just trimming off. So that's our surface there, the dark layers, a bit of spoil on top, but the real line there of no root growth. It's not, might be due to carbon, but it's not actually due to carbon. It's due to acidity and the really high aluminium that kicks in and just trims those roots off. So dealing with these constraints, you see the patchiness there. I've seen that quite a number of times. Back to that data set, through this area, we can see we've got low aluminium being the toxic thing, low aluminium in the blue, moving up into greens, yellow and red where it's high. That's in the 0 to 10. Through this area though, lots of subsurface acidity. So this is in the 10 to 20. I just mentioned Jason's work looking at finer increments. He's looking at 5 centimetre increments. That's really identifying some constraints to overcome and helping, improve plant growth and potentially inputs and carbon levels. Given the time, I might sort of keep going, but just wanted to show that you can, not just by incorporating, but you can top dress lime, top dress here, pH increasing, top dress and lime decreasing. Here up at Manus, so this was master out at Book near Wagga. This was up further into a little bit higher, top dressed lime here, and it's dropped over the 3 years through the profile. Aluminium has dropped, so good things. Focusing on bringing it back to carbon as the focus. Excuse me, another paper, John Gray's recently looked at opportunities where he had an increase in long-term vegetation across New South Wales, and where were the opportunities to increase carbon levels. Not much where it doesn't rain too much, understandably. Not much where there's already high levels. But the soil type with the rainfall is the key driver here. And these darker areas are often the volcanic basalt sort of areas. So that clay material and the fertile soil provides protection for the organic matter, as we mentioned earlier. Oops, slow down. So there are problems coming for us, though, with the whole reason there's a carbon market is climate change, and with that, we've got increasing temperatures. The modelling here shows that we're not looking at increasing too much, but actually struggling to hold on to what we've got. So the different maps here are looking at from the 2050s and the 2090s, in the middle of the road sort of scenario, or high emissions and even warmer climate scenarios where rainfall is more erratic, so plant growth is more sporadic, but bugs can keep eating. Temperatures are warmer, so bugs can stay more active, and we've got losses of carbon. No gains here, all losses in carbon levels. So doing what we can to look after it's going to be really key for the benefits that organic matter provides, of stability, of nutrient cycling, of water infiltration, and soft, nice environments for roots to grow. And those benefits are real. There's not much work looking at the financial sort of benefits of productivity, or the financial benefits of organic matter, but a couple of bits is like Rochelle Meyer from 2015 found about $100 a hectare in the high rainfall areas from better organic matter levels, and in the lower rainfall areas a bit less. I think it was around $20 to $25 a hectare per year. $100 a hectare per year to $25 a hectare per year in with more organic matter. And Anthony Ringrose Vos around Wagga looked at organic matter in different areas as well, based on soil landscape mapping. And on the sloping country, there was again about $100 a hectare more per year from soils with another 1% carbon in their soils. On some flatter country, on lower lying undulating country, he actually found that there was a greater productivity to the tune of $225, I think it was, per hectare per year from productivity that organic matter was supporting. Another thing you can look at is stability of your soil. So organic matter, as I said, the dark stuff, if it's there, it stabilizes the soil. And this is something you can do nice and quickly yourself. The dark material, when it goes in, it's stable. Where there's less organic matter, it falls apart, and it's as quickly as this. Do you have a good level of organic matter in your soil? This one, yes. This one, not so much. Quick as that. Test your soil, test your pH, keep an eye on things, look at salinity, look at other constraints in your soil. These things are available and really easy and quick to do. Dig a hole and see what's there. Avoid erosion. Keeping what's there is key. It's can be sadly too easy to lose, harder to build. Don't be like this guy. Now back to the idea of carbon trading. Here are the methods available under the ERF, and they're new methods. They're not new so much as never heard of them before, because basically they're all agronomy, but they're new to apply to your land if they haven't been done before. Things like applying ameliorants, basically dealing with constraints, applying more water, what you might do about moving into pasture phases or retaining cropping, engineering things like delving, whatnot, and getting legumes and perenniality and nitrogen sources into the system there. All things that are available. When you're looking at that, it would be advisable to consider the commitments required to what practices, what time frame, what risks might be involved, and what options you have if it looks like it doesn't actually work for you. Would an aggregator come and help you take preliminary measurements so you can understand where you're starting from? Statements too grand. I've just shown a lot of things where it's good to be. It would be advisable to be aware of some of the limitations that the natural process that happen in soil. Some of these things that I have heard is that people will guarantee an increase, that there'll be an infinite capacity of soil for carbon, that doing these things is easy. Be aware of those sorts of things. How much extra biomass is needed? How long will these increases persist? Are there new bugs around that's going to revolutionise the system for you? What evidence is there for you? Would they have relevant examples of success that they could share with you? And importantly, are there examples where no increases have been found, which there are? Would they be happy to discuss those with you, and how rigorous is any proof? So definitely opportunities, but be aware of things that, that's a dynamic system. So finally, some key points out of this. Look at what you've got and where your starting point is. Look at where you might get to by looking at some regional levels and understanding the system around you. It's about having more inputs, more growth basically, and less outputs, slowing the mineralization and definitely stopping erosion, preventing erosion as much as possible. Much harder to build than it is to lose. We have this thing called priming, where the dynamics can be really triggered, and it can go both ways. Things like fertility, dealing with constraints, organic matter deep in the soil, micro sort of changes with waterlogging and exudates from plants, and even application of biochar. Sometimes they can increase the level and sometimes they can decrease the level. Lots of dynamics. So definitely we know that loss has been common and we can get increases, just not necessarily easy. And having more long-term work is really important to understand what's going on. Manage what you can and do it well. And if you're looking at a project, just see how it might actually sit with your systems. So I might just leave it there and hand over to you, Abe.
Thanks, Karl. Working. Okay. So Karl set me up really well. They're talking about sort of broader processes of carbon in the landscape, and some of the trends across the management systems in Riverine Plains. And I'm going to hone in a little bit further. If you saw on the market opportunity slide on that last option of using cover crops, and sort of addressing soil stoichiometry, or nutritional constraints, which we can do through building plant diversity in our cropping systems. So if you're a mixed enterprise person, this might not feel directly tangible to you, but the underpinning principles of plant diversity are still really important and you can take into your system too. So just first up, I'd like to thank Jane and Sarah, because we do these trials with Riverine Plains and Sarah for organising this, then also Felicity and CRC for the work that they've put into this, and everyone else there that's collaborated on the data that I'm going to be presenting today. So our trials, and we have a twin trial with Riverine Plains and Central West farming systems, and they've been looking at how we can, I guess, improve soil condition through plant diversity in cropping systems. So we've been using summer cover crops, temporary intercropping, where we've grown clover or vetch in our wheat years and terminated that to sort of get the benefits of the legume in there without sort of stealing grain-filled rainfall in spring through that termination. And then this year we've set up full intercropping across both sites. And that's what this photo is here down in the bottom right, where we've got favour being grown with canola. And while I don't have many results on the intercropping, I think from a carbon perspective, it's a really exciting system. So just to sort of define the systems that we've been looking at and the benefits that they provide. So summer cover crops, by having living roots in the ground, in theory, they should build soil carbon. And that's what the literature from the Northern Hemisphere is sort of telling us. But it's a very different system climatically to what we've got here. A lot of the work that we assume why summer cover crops won't work in Australia is around the use of water and type of nitrogen. But the counter argument that we put when we look at our data that comes from these trials is that having this diversity, so having different, I guess, players in the system with different root exudates, encouraging plant growth through the different interactions of the different species, but then also feeding that soil ecosystem is something that can possibly generate enough benefit to overcome these issues of water use and the type of nitrogen. Our intercropping systems, as I mentioned before, really we're looking at the plant-plant relationships between usually a legume and our grain crop being canola and wheat in our trials. Now, these are really exciting because we see this concept of over-yielding occur in intercrop systems, and there's been a fair bit of data coming out in support of that from South Australia over recent years, and then that nitrogen fixation from having that legume in there. The reason we're interested in this is because of soil carbon cycling. So Karl set this up really well. I won't dwell on it too much, but the concept that we're really looking at is just increased biomass, with our plants being the interface between carbon in the atmosphere and then carbon in the soil. So they draw that down and then store it in the soil. By promoting diversity of the inputs to soil carbon, we're hoping that we can produce or promote a more diverse or higher biomass soil microbial ecosystem. And then so those things together increase our soil carbon. And then we have the added benefits that we see some evidence for in intercropping systems, where there's increased resource use efficiency, so acquisition of different forms of nutrients in the soil, but also promoting higher water use efficiency as well, which then feeds back into our increased biomass and therefore increased carbon. One of the issues around soil carbon cycling that I have with this diagram is we see something like this all the time, where it's a perennial input system. In our cropping system, so this photo is from our Central West trial, we have an extended period of time whether it's a summer fallow or a long fallow for some of the lower rainfall systems where we don't have any living roots in the ground. I'm going to explain why this is such a limitation around building soil carbon in cropping systems and how that's something that we need to overcome. I'll talk about this a little bit more later to sort of tie it all together, but we're interested in soil carbon for those reasons that Karl talked about. So, but it's really important for our soil health. So if we are promoting soil carbon building or even just preventing soil carbon decline, we're maintaining the soil health in the system. And so we're going to have that, I guess, longevity of supported production, sustainability in our system. And then we also have these other opportunities around markets where we have things like the ERF, but also things like environmental credentials, which are becoming more and more important. And I'll talk more about those at the end. So just to quickly show you the trials that I'll be presenting data from today, there's 4 of them. So we've got the 2 long-term trials with Riverine Plains at Barramine, and then also that trial is mirrored with Central West at Gunning Gap. We collect sort of, I guess, data 3 or 4 times a year from those systems. And we've actually done 2 trials with Birchip Cropping Group out in the Mallee, and then also with Facey Group over in Southwest WA, where we have some higher temporal resolution sample trials. Now, the controls on soil carbon being biomass inputs, climate, they're universal across trial sites, and then just the maximum or the actual amount of soil carbon that are in those systems is what's sort of determined by more local scale factors. So we can still read a fair bit from these trials where we've got the single season at Birchip and with Facey Group, just based on those first principles of soil carbon building. So in our trials, this is what we've been growing. So we've sort of got 2 phases. We had the 2019 to flood phase where both trials didn't grow anything, where we're looking at buckwheat and 4 species mixes for our summer cover crops, and then wheat and clover or wheat and vetch temporary intercropping, and then we moved to a 3 and 9 species summer cover crop at Riverine Plains with our full intercropping going in this year. And a similar setup at Central West. So you can see that those trials have been in for a fair amount of time. In terms of the site characteristics, this is what we've been sort of, or I guess what it is. It is what it is when you're dealing with a site. So those are annual rainfall. So you can see our Central West site is higher with lower rainfall at BCG. But again, those first principles are you can transfer those across different climates and different soil types. So this is the story so far around carbon inputs for Riverine Plains. So I don't actually have total or soil organic carbon, our total carbon, because that is a pretty boring graph when I show you the Central West one on the next slide. It remains pretty stable around that 1.75% total carbon. What I've got here is water-soluble carbon and hot water extractable organic carbon, which is an indicator for some of those more labile forms of carbon. So there's fresher inputs. So I guess an indicator of what biomass is entering the system. And then I've also got a microbial carbon, biomass carbon, as well, for an indicator of the size of that soil ecosystem that is a major component of our soil carbon. And you can see there aren't many treatment differences. So I split so our multi-species is our 9 species mix, our low diversity is our buckwheat or 3 species mix, and we've got our temporary intercropping. We had an additional treatment at Central West, which was our summer cover crop followed by temporary intercropping, and we called that max diversity. In these systems, in these treatments, we aren't providing any more carbon than the control, which is our fallow system. And so this helps explain why we don't see those changes in soil organic carbon. And so if we look at that from a total carbon perspective, we get something like this, where there's a lot less variability because that existing organic carbon pool is a lot bigger than the labile pool. And so by not increasing these labile inputs in our treatments, we're not going to increase our total soil carbon. Now, this boils down to biomass. So this is the biomass each year from our summer cover crop treatments at Central West and Riverine Plains. You can see not a lot of consistency because there's a lot of challenges in growing a summer cover crop. Some years we aren't able to get them up, and some years we only produce sort of less than half a tonne to the hectare. Sometimes we have some good years, sometimes we have some medium years. It'll be interesting to see what happens after this year because we've got pretty good biomass and repeat good biomass at Central West. But overall, we haven't seen any changes to that system based on summer cover crop biomass. And this is because our cash crop biomass really dwarfs our summer cover crop biomass. And so this is why our intercropping, or our fall intercropping, is a really promising method for increasing soil carbon. So you can see at our sort of peak biomass from 2019 through to now, I guess the biomass levels are a lot higher in our cash crops. The question always comes up around water use and summer cover crop biomass. I won't dwell on this too much because it sort of diverts a little bit from carbon, but it's really interesting and really important to contextualise our summer cover crop production, because that's a trade-off that you're going to have to consider if you're going to use your summer cover crop to sequester carbon. We can see that there's declining water in our treatments compared or relative to the control. So that value of 1 means they're equal. Above that means there's more water in the treatment. But with our increasing summer cover crop biomass, we get decreasing water available at sowing. The next one is the ratio, or the response ratio of our yield. So we have some challenges in getting yields with the climate variability, the climate extremes that we saw over that late 2019, early 2020s period. But from the years that we've got, we found that there isn't really a response to amount of water available at sowing in yield, and that's shown by those basically forming a straight vertical line there in our treatments. And that's because our in-season conditions are really important. So things like your grain fill, rainfall, terminal drought. I don't have temporary intercropping data on there because there was no impact on yield, and we didn't see any sort of response to grain protein either, which is a little bit disappointing because we were hoping to sort of see that from that increased nitrogen in the system. But that's going to be one to watch to see how that nitrogen cycles through the system into the future. So overall, from our trials, what we need more work on, and what we're going to do, because these run out to 2028, is look at the differences in nutrient acquisition in these diverse systems, trying to elucidate what's going on with the water use efficiency in our diverse systems, and this impact of over yielding that we're hoping to see in our intercrop system. And by having our diversity, if we're improving our nutrient acquisition, there's some evidence emerging for improved water use efficiency, which is really important for the Australian context. And if we're driving this over yielding, then these are things that can help build our soil carbon because they establish that positive feedback with our biomass. Now, to explain why that low summer cover biomass isn't yielding changes in soil carbon or soil health, it comes down to the low biomass, which we see in our FACED group trial here. So the sampling stages are cover crop peak biomass, then we've got cash crop sowing, and then peak biomass for the cash crop. So there isn't much of a response to cash crop peak biomass, and then we see, cover crop peak biomass, and then we see an increase, small increase in our total soil carbon, not much response in our soil nitrogen, but our permanganate oxidizable C, which is another measurement of labile carbon, slightly different to the other one, so we didn't collect standard measurements across all our trials, but we have that response in our labile carbon to our cash crop growing that 6 tonne to the hectare of biomass. What we also get is increasing carbon without an increase in nitrogen. And this is problematic for building soil carbon because I'll show you on the next slide, slightly different system, but that stoichiometry, so the ratio of carbon and nitrogen in our system is really important for being able to build soil carbon, as Karl sort of alluded to. So again, at our BCG trial, so we actually used winter covers compared to a long fallow and then cash crops, really low biomass yield across the response, but the protein available for our soil microbes falls off a cliff when we get to harvest or termination of those winter covers. So you see there's not much variability in our water soluble carbon or our hot water extractable carbon because we didn't produce a lot of biomass. But as soon as we don't have those living roots in the ground, we don't have those nutrients available to our soil microbes. So they go and mine this available carbon for that nitrogen, they respire that carbon, and so it's not actually adding to the system and it's then quickly lost. So there's sort of a dual role of not just having biomass in the system, but also supplying those supporting nutrients that the microbes need to maintain carbon in that soil ecosystem, so in that pool as a whole. And if you can address both of those, you're giving yourself a better chance of increasing that soil carbon. Karl talked about soil constraints, so I won't talk about them too much, but this is a photo from the Riverine Plains site where we have soil acidity at about 15 centimetres and a hard set layer due to dispersion. And so this year I should have put the photo of the canola up, where the canola goes down sort of 10 centimetres and then runs at right angles. We saw it in the brassicas, in our summer cover crop as well. They can't get through that layer. So the only thing I want to reinforce here from what Karl said is take time to identify any soil constraints you have. Because if you can address those and increase your biomass, increase your carbon as a result, then you are in the ballpark for the ERF, but you're also going to help your own system. And this is the one thing that I probably want to highlight the most around this. So if you don't take home the carbon dynamic stuff because it's a bit too much science, it's really important to recognize whether you're participating in the market or not, that as a grower, yield is always your key target. It's what you're going to be chasing, and carbon markets become secondary. Sure, they can buffer in a bit of stability around your income, but anything that targets your soil health, so increasing your biomass production, increasing your diversity in your system to address or to use nutrients better, use water better, and then feed that soil ecosystem and build that carbon that's in that soil, stored in those microbes, stored in those dead microbes and those residues. Anything you do that targets that is going to help not just with your yield, but also allows you to have that market access. And market access, while it's about carbon markets at the moment, your environmental credentials around sustainability are really important to your social license and being able to leverage supply chains into the future. These are going to become increasingly important to maintain that market access. So it's not just about markets, it's not just about the economics, it's also about the health and productivity over the long term in your system. So I don't think I'll go over the take-home messages, but basically we're looking at diverse cropping systems because of the benefits that they could have and the translation to soil carbon that we can build in these diverse systems, but also reverse that declining trend in soil fertility in Australia's cropping systems. So I'll finish with that and I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Abe. Thank you, Karl, too. We do have some questions and I will read them to you. The first one are for you, Karl. The first one was, were the losses in systems that were being actively managed to build soil carbon? And were any of these data sets looking at soil fractions and losses and gains across these over multiple years?
Yeah, thank you. So when some of the trials are designed for looking at carbon, and some of the trials are looking at productivity or other things, and carbon is measured as a supplementary measure. The work from Condo was one of those where it was looking at farming systems, and carbon just happened to be measured. So bulk density was not measured as part of those. So it was just percent. Bulk density, though, varies much less than carbon will. It sort of just fluctuate around a little bit. It definitely does vary, but varies a little bit less. The types of changes, though, that were seen in the carbon levels were pretty real, though, and fractions were measured as part of that. And I've just got that one here that I can show you. You can go to the actual paper. Let's share. The actual paper. Here are the couple of tables that you're probably interested in out of that. Warwick Badgery's paper looking at the data that Neil Fattel and others had collected over those years for the 0 to 10 on the left and the 10 to 30 on the right. And each of these are the fractions, so total, and then the different fractions, particulate, humic, or a bit of an outmoded term, but call it mineral associated, and recalcitrant or resistant, being the charcoalish one. And that one's not supposed to move. It's inert. It's recalcitrant, but we've got changes in it. But anyway, you can see the changes there. The particulate is a much more dynamic one, and that's what comes in, bugs eat it, and out it goes. It's not a bad thing. Cycling is really important. So fractions, and in terms of measuring, managing with the intent to increase carbon, there, different practices are put in place to be realistic options and see what happens to carbon levels. So yeah, that's the aim of a lot of these things. Some of the other stuff that I showed of those regional patterns are just that, sort of explaining, showing what happens across different environments. But those smaller trials, they're often about targeting practices like Abe's looking at. One of the things, farming productivity for one, but also what's happening with carbon as well.
Yep. Thank you, Karl. And this other is related to that one. When there was the initial 5 years mentioned in the paper, was the subsequent sampling another 5 years after the first measurement period? And what were the land management practices or technologies being used in this paper?
Yes, that was after another 5 years. That paper is just being prepared and ready for publication at the moment. But the previous paper, I didn't actually put the reference in for that, but that was in soil research. Again, Warwick Badgery, the lead author, Brian Murphy, Annette Cowie, Suze Orgel, Aaron Simmons, Andrew Rawson, a bunch of others. And from 2021, and I'll just share the table in it for you. There, these are the different practices for these different sites, going like, cropping to cropping, pasture, cropping, the starting management, shifting to the new management, and in those included adding organic matter to them.
Well, thank you, Karl. We have 2 more. Is there any data sets that look beyond the labeled carbon pools in cropping available, sub 30 centimeters? This can be answered by you both. Anyone who wants, maybe some.
Not off the top of my guess would be yes. I'd imagine there'd be data out there with all the various soil carbon survey projects that have been done. That I can't rattle them off the top of my head. Karl might be able to, but
yeah,
Great.
I'm not sure if the question, labile is a term that means readily processed, readily decomposed. So that's one thing, that's looking at those fractions and some of the stuff that Abe looked at, that recent material that's full of energy and nutrients that bugs can just get at and do and cycle. And that's a good thing in soil. And that's where most of it goes. Most of it gets respired back out. Systems circulate, and the reason I showed the soil profiles is to look at the distribution of organic matter in the soil. Soil profiles develop over thousands of years, and to have a bit of organic matter in the surface and not much below that says that over thousands of years, not just 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, let's stretch it out to a 25-year project, that's a long time, thousands of years, that all we've got is 0.2%, then, that shows that bugs are active. Shows a bit of erosion losses as well, but that's the system. Now, depth is a really interesting one. Depth gets used as a sort of, a bit of a hope for, look, we'll get organic matter deep in the soil, and that'll that'll be there for a long time, and we can really store that away. Similarly, from what I just said, that's where the low levels sort of sit, and it's very common. There is a bunch of carbon at depth, but generally much lower levels. So the fact that it is older, and I'm just trying to grab something, sorry, as we talk, but so carbon at depth, when they do dating on it, you can say like it might be, say, 7,000 years old. And you think, okay, well, that means that we can put carbon down there and it'll last for 7,000 years. It doesn't actually mean that so much as everything that's grown over those 7,000 years, all we've got is this 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, whatever percent. The rest has been cycled, or it's actually gone down, roots grow deep, but they go down pores. They don't actually fill the whole soil. They go down the path of least resistance. They follow channels that have been made by bugs where water's going. They put, associations, fungi, root hairs out into the rest of the soil and try to access things, but they're not actually filling the soil as such. There's some work that's actually shown that fresh organic matter that gets down deep in the soil is being a source of labile, nutrients and energy, can actually kick bugs into gear, and they gobble that up. But not only do they gobble that up, but the flush of nutrients means that organic matter that has been there for thousands of years also gets mineralized and removed. So that's part of that priming process, and it just depends. Sometimes things can be put in there and increase, but sometimes just as much, they'll cycle. And it makes thermodynamic sense because, if there's a source of nutrients and energy sitting there, then someone's going to work out a way to get at it. There's bugs in Antarctic ice sheets. There's bugs in the bottom of the ocean on thermal, volcanic vents, living and cycling things. So getting into a little clod of soil is not too hard, I don't think.
Great. Thank you, Karl, for that. We have one last question. It says, if you can only be in a soil carbon project, I'm assuming, if you get issued credits based on a practice change plus measurement plus auditing, then that will eliminate systems who can build soil carbon in a 5-year period. A live project is only started after the T1 plus accuse issued.
I'll have a crack at that. Yeah, the short answer is yeah, you do get, you are kind of excluded. And so that's one of the big issues. And when you talk to, I guess when I've spoken to other growers on the ground, is that, and to the other grower groups as well, there is almost a sense of frustration in some of these cropping systems about not being able to participate in the market. The flip side of that is the consultants and stuff that are out there do their due diligence before they start a project. So they'll assess your scope for change. A lot of them have their own proprietary models based on remote sensing and stuff like that, and they'll take some preliminary sampling that they use to assess whether your property and your management practice that you want to implement is a good fit for a soil carbon project. The short answer is unfortunately that it's not quite for everyone at the moment. And I think from an industry point of view, to look at it from another perspective, that's being recognised really quickly. And so specific industries, peak bodies are trying to look at how, or even like the buyers of, I guess, of our cropping products, of our livestock products themselves, are looking at how they can pay growers for doing the right thing by their soil. And so there's a lot of opportunities that aren't quite there yet around leveraging supply chains. So having customers, having the consumer pay that additional charge on a product that's been sourced what is considered to be sustainably. That kind of stuff is, I think, developing really quickly and coming into our supply chains. So while at the moment a lot of people are automatically excluded, and it's not just those that can't build soil carbon, it's those that can't build soil carbon over a big enough area as well that are excluded. While there are a lot of people excluded from the market, these other opportunities for I guess paying for sustainability or reward. Sorry, I shouldn't say paying for, it makes it sound a bit negative, but rewarding sustainable farming practices are coming closer and closer each day. So it's not a total bad news story for those that are excluded from the market.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abe.
Yeah, I'd agree. I might just add to that, or reiterate that, the numbers I mentioned earlier of productivity from having a good level of carbon in your soil are real. There's just limited information available. Studies haven't been done. But to say $100 hectare per year and $200 hectare per year in $1997, that's substantial. So that's one thing, functioning soil. To people will say, oh, I've done all these good things and I'm going to miss out now. You haven't missed out. You've had your gains. You've got a resilient, productive system. Nothing wrong with that. I've heard people say, oh, let's drive the carbon level down so that we can increase it again. It's one of the craziest things I've ever heard. It's just beyond ridiculous. What Abe was saying about those other markets as well is real. People will be looking, there's these things, scope 1, scope 2 are things that you do in terms of emissions. Scope 3 is what other people do. You become someone else's scope 3 in your practices. If you can show that you have a low emissions intensity system, then that sets you ahead and makes you a preferable supplier. It also means, goes back to that productivity, if you're producing efficiently, then you're getting better water use efficiency, better fertility management, all those things, quicker livestock turn off, all those are great benefits there without actually saying I need to justify a gain of 10 tons of carbon in the soil and then keep it there. And if you sell it, be responsible for it, but not actually own it yourself. So lots of things to consider and lots of positives amongst it anyway.
Thank you, Karl and Abe. I will just go through this comment from Ari that she said that the permanence period commences the date that you are issued with your credits from your T1 sampling event. T1 is the first sampling event after your TO or baseline, and landholders can choose how they manage their credits, wholesale, and depending on what they want. Well, we have no more questions, so I really wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and a special thanks to Abe and Karl, as well as Felicity and Jane for helping me. And as I mentioned earlier, the upcoming webinars will be delivered by other soil CRC participants. We'll have the Mali Sustainable Farming and the Farmling webinars coming soon. And yeah, you can check the event page of Soil CRC to register and find the recordings from the past webinars on their website too. And we'll be uploading this one to our webpage, and we'll be sharing with you the recording and the fact sheets in the upcoming weeks. Well, thank you everyone, and have a lovely night.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.